Welcome to Module 1, where we're going to set kind of the foundation for ecotourism. So one of the first things you need to realize is that ecotourism is a new term. It's a new idea, new concept. It was kind of emerged in the mid-'80s. Even though it's been in practice for quite some time, we haven't necessarily defined it. And so, when you think about tourism, that idea has been around for, for a significantly longer period of time. And we'll talk just a brief bit about that. But ecotourism, the idea of eco, is a key component to this because it references the idea of ecological. Right? And when you do that, that means that we have to take into the ecological aspects and components of tourism. Even though the Forest Service in Canada was using the term ecotours earlier, it wasn't necessarily defined as ecotourism. And the idea behind it and its roots come from the symbiosis or symbiotic idea of how can tourism and the environment play together, right, in a mutually beneficial way. So it essentially involves this observation and appreciation for the natural world while also taking into account the social, cultural, and the ecological impacts. Now, this is coming from a widely used text, but if you think there's one aspect that it's not accounting for, it's taking into account the people, it's taking into account the environment, it is absolutely taking into account the ideas of tourism, but it's missing a key component that we cannot forget, and that's the economics behind it. Right? And how does that play out as it relates to tourism and ecotourism? So one way to kind of think about tourism as a whole is through Jafari's 4 platforms. And this was really coming out at the end of World War II in the mid-1940s, is we saw a huge increase in the standard of life, right? Quality of life, standard in which we were able to live. We saw a lot more developments. We saw kind of more of the, the nuclear family really being developed, and we had more time and we had more discretionary income. As a result, as those go up, so do tourism. With that in mind, as mass tourism increases, we also potentially have some issues. And that's kind of what Jafari's platforms kind of addresses, is the emergence and kind of where we are now. And so if you take a look in the 50s and 60s, it was really all about this idea. Growth in tourism was encouraged. There was very few negative consequences because it was seen as an opportunity for economic development in some of these peripheral areas. If we think about some of the places that were really developed as tourism spots in the 50s and 60s, it was areas that were kind of on the periphery, right? People weren't generally traveling there, and so it was seen as in very positive light. As the 70s, as population increases, environmental degradation starts really taking hold. If we can take a look back, think about some key things and works that were coming out, like Silent Springs. We started having this understanding that we're destroying parts of the environment. And so the cautionary platform is we started seeing regulations, and we started seeing some negative consequences of tourism. In particular, one that I mentioned here is the idea of revenue leakage. Revenue leakage is money that comes into a system, right, an area as a result of tourism, and because of particularly who owns it and how it's owned, the money comes out of that system. And when that happens, it doesn't get cycled, right? And so when you think about revenue leakage, it can be very problematic because of you come in, you have an impact on an area, and then you pull out of an area. And when that happens, we can see a lot of problems. For those in the Appalachian region, very relevant when we think about natural resource extraction, coal and natural gas development. Great example of what happens to when revenue leakage happens. So the cautionary platform, and then we had this, in the 80s, we started thinking about how do we adapt, right? Tourism's good, it's working, but there's some problems with it, so how do we adapt? So new forms of tourism start emerging as a result, and which ultimately led us to, kind of current. I think I could change the knowledge-based platform from current, because I think we might be beyond that, but only through reflection do we actually know that. And so at this point, we start looking at this holistic approach, and we start thinking about this idea of sustainability. We start trying to really make informed approaches to tourism. So another way in which we kind of set baselines for talking about tourism, ecotourism, is through these three core criteria. World Tourism Organization looks at only certain types of travel qualify. That's easy to think about. Business travel, right? Work-related travel does not qualify. It has to be for touristic type purposes, right? It does get a little bit muddy, right? If I'm at a place for business, and that's why I go there, but then I stay on a few extra days and actually travel around to go see some of the tourist spots, then that, is where it becomes a little bit problematic. Tourism involves a spatial component. That means you have to travel a certain distance in order to be considered a tourist. And so if you stay in your local area, and even if you go to a touristic site, doesn't necessarily mean that you are a tourist to that area. Now, oftentimes when we're looking at measuring, right, tourism's impacts, you could still count the locals that would go to that touristic site, but you need to separate it out from those who would travel there from certain distances. And we oftentimes see that in good economic impact studies around tourism, or how do we differentiate in terms of the benefits of these touristic places, these locations, for the locals versus those who are coming in to see these attractions or these locations. And tourists are differentiated based on time. That's the amount of time that they would spend in a certain location. And so how long are they going to actually visit and stay in some of our national parks? How long do they stay in a certain area or part of a country? Right? And that obviously changes based on the number of things to do, how hard it is to get to a location, and some of those factors. So the three criteria that when we look at ecotourism is there's this nature-based element, is that we have to take a look at this intentional interaction, and that's the key piece. There's an intentional interaction with the natural environment. That could be our primary motivation, is that we want to engage in the natural world in some way. There's always this idea of, how does culture play into it, right? Because in many of these places, nature and culture actually can merge, right? And they have some separations, but most cultures have a very strong naturalistic component to it, right? It has influenced the way and continues to influence the way in which they live and how they live. And so I generally think culture is kind of a separate idea behind it, right? But I didn't come up with these three core criteria. But I also, that's why I'm asking the question. This educational component, there comes in two different forms, the formal or informal. So a way that you can think about this as formal is I go to a national park or a state park, and I go through a education kind of program with a naturalist. That would be a very formalized. The informal is maybe through the interpretive signs, right? It's kind of my own speed. I can engage in it as long as I want. We're seeing technology actually come in and play here. Is that now you're seeing a lot of places starting to figure out how to bring in certain apps and educational components in which to engage. I think that's going to, in some way, blend this idea between formal and informal, because you can bring in very formal kind of components that can be expanded upon beyond just what we would normally see in an informal. And so I think technology it's really going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And so again, I don't want you to think of this as, kind of black or white. There's a lot of gray in between these two. But when you take a look at deep or shallow, the idea of deep is that it's a fully immersive type of experience. And we can see that through environmental ed programs. That's kind of how I start thinking about them, that you would go someplace and you might spend an afternoon doing a stream study as part of a formalized program within a park. And so you would also potentially see volunteer scientists. This is kind of a big thing. I think one of the organizations that does this really well is the Appalachian Mountain Club up in New England, is where they will have citizen scientists do plant identifications as part of their hiking up there. They'll also do air quality as part of their hiking up there. And so you can start, kind of doing this informal, but it becomes a really deep, immersive type of experience, because then you're asking them to collect, data for you, and then that can expand their knowledge over a longer period of time as a tourist. So I always appreciate that. And again, this idea of sustainability, right? And this one gets kind of murky. As you recall, at the very beginning, I said one of the things that we are going to try to contemplate, we will contemplate, we might get close to answering, maybe, but is tourism, ecotourism, truly sustainable? Can it be? Right? At its deepest roots, can it be? And so this is kind of where that gets into this environmental piece, right? And this anthropocentric versus biocentric, very easy, anthropocentric, all about the humanistic view of it. It's for me, it's all about me as a human, versus biocentric. I am as part of the environment. And when I become part of the environment, this is a key piece, is when I become part of the environment, that means we are recognizing that I will have an impact on the environment. That's how the natural world works. You will have an impact, but what type of impact and how much impact? And that's what we try to address in positive ecotourism. And then you've got the development versus preservation. The idea of development is that we have these natural areas that we need to consider how do we develop them to expose people to it, to provide opportunity. If we develop them appropriately, we can concentrate use, right? And kind of direct people to where we want them to go and have a more direct, isolated impact. Versus this more preservation is we need to preserve it for the sake of itself and have as minimal impact. And we do this oftentimes through permitting, through the way that we are developing certain areas, what we allow to happen in certain areas. A great example is wilderness areas. You can only go in certain size groups. Oftentimes they'll even control where you could potentially go in those areas as well. The environmental and social cultural piece, ecotourism should improve the welfare of the local people. This, I think, is a foundational element that separates ecotourism from tourism, right? And even as we talk later in the semester about this ideas of excursions, right? I think excursionary ecotourist opportunities can have an interaction with the environment. But where does that social piece come into it? Where is that social cultural piece? How are we respecting the local culture and the local people? And so But what I really like about this, it isn't just about this idea of respect. It's about improvement. And remember I talked earlier about this idea of revenue leakage. So how do we potentially minimize revenue leakage? Because when we can increase the economic opportunities for locals, oftentimes that can equate to positive social benefits, health and education and infrastructure, right? Those can be done poorly, and we can see that it can become problematic. But I'll use an example, and you'll hear me use it a lot throughout the semester, is Costa Rica. I think Costa Rica is one of those ideal places where ecotourism and tourism have kind of changed the face of that country. When it comes to improving the welfare of the local people, they, depending on where you look, 94 to 97% literacy rates. That's pretty big. And a lot of that has come not only because of their ideals as a culture and as a country, but also because of some of that economic benefits that have resulted from tourism and ecotourism. So the ideas, as we go through next, this idea of status quo versus enhancement, we know we really want to look at this idea. If we just maintain it as it is that considered sustainable, right? Depending on how we do it versus this idea of enhancement, can we make it better? If you do it correctly, you can, through enhancement, you can make it more sustainable. But these, again, are just ideas that we want to lay the foundation for, that we need to kind of have in our mind as we look at the different topics throughout this semester. Remember I said we were going to ask this question, is sustainability a realistic criteria? I can tell you I don't necessarily know. It's something I constantly think about. Several years ago, there was this national kind of like blackout day in the United States to kind of recognize our carbon footprint. I remember that morning they were talking with an expert on our carbon impact. And at the end of it, they asked him, what would you do? What would be the number one behavior that you could change if you wanted to reduce your environmental, and in this case, carbon footprint? He said, I wouldn't fly. I would never get on a plane. He recognized that a lot of his work requires him to travel the world, right? Giving talks, speeches, doing research. He said that would be the number one thing he would change. Oftentimes, when we think about tourism and ecotourism, we oftentimes get in a plane. So even at its roots, right, at the beginning of our ecotourism experience, we're automatically hitting some type of, pretty significant environmental, negative environmental behavior, right? And so, it's something that I don't ever think will be perfect, but I think we should always strive for it. And what's sustainable today might not be sustainable tomorrow. So it becomes this evolution, and how do we evolve as part of it? And so you will see, right, to insist that it must be sustainable is unrealistic. I think that is a very hard line to take on this approach, and I highlight it because it was part of the readings, but I think we need to consider that, right? I don't think that it should be a requirement because there's varying degrees of sustainability, but it's something that we need to constantly strive for. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about this idea of paradigms, and this has a direct relation to kind of the course throughout the time. But first, we need to ask, what is a paradigm? Let's think for a second. We've probably heard the term. But it's in a collective worldview or an entire constellation of beliefs, values, techniques, and so shared by the members of a given community. So it's kind of, I would say, a collective idea or value. When we think about it in those terms, how many paradigm shifts, right? The changes in the way that we think have occurred. And let's just make it for, if we look at it globally, I think that's a harder way to put our arms around it. But if we think about it even within a country, it becomes more manageable. We can also think about it within our communities, within our families, and within ourselves. So to throw out a few, think about the ideas of equality and how that has changed. Notice these things don't happen overnight. A paradigm shift isn't necessarily like a light switch, right? It happens over time, and we're still, dealing with those ideas of equality, right? And we've taken those on at different paces based on the populace, right? We oftentimes think of kind of race, right? And how the equality has played out with race. Gender, how that's played out. How it's playing out with different groups in terms of sexual orientation and identity. Right? These are big shifts in kind of our shared beliefs, okay? And again, the big thing to recognize, this isn't a light switch type piece. It happens over time, and we continue to evolve with it. So, kind of already alluded to that. It's where it gradually emerges and replaces a previous or existing paradigm. Scientific paradigm, it's where, again, we start using scientific knowledge to inform what we do, right, and how we behave and how we act. One that's important for what we're talking about is this idea of dominant Western environmental paradigm, right? For the longest time, the environment was here for us. It's ours. If you take back, that has some very strong religious roots, right, to it. Some of the Puritan kind of teachings was, it is here for me. This idea of manifest destiny, to subdue, to control, and to conquer. That's what my role was from an environmental standpoint. And so it was a very anthropocentric view for the longest time. It's all about me as a member of the human race, that the environment's there to provide me with what I need. And when we have that type of thinking, that allows us to justify environmental degradation, environmental destruction, environmental manipulation. If we can change that, and we've been in that, right? Again, people would argue that, it's been happening for quite some time. We really start seeing the emergence of this, as scientific knowledge, increases. But we really start seeing it, in my opinion, in the 60s and 70s, were the foundations for this environmental kind of movement, right? We started seeing some real consequences. Rivers on fire, water changing to orange, right? We think about our local Appalachian region. We can drive 5-10 minutes right from campus, and we will see orange rivers. We started to recognize there's a consequence for our behavior and having this environmental destruction. And so as a result, we started to kind of make a shift, right, and to say, hey, this is not okay. And it's tough to say that we have, at least in the United States, made this full kind of shift away from the dominant, environmental paradigm to this more where we are environmental action-oriented. I think the idealistic person in me wants to believe that we have made that progress. Certain policies make me question that. But we have done quite a bit. I use a very common one. When I was growing up, recycling wasn't very common, right? It just wasn't. The ideas of bringing your own bags to shop, who did that, right? Now, in many parts of the world and in many public places, recycling is just normal. It's what we've always done. Many people within the younger generation, that's all they've known. And so I think that's kind of an indication of that's where we've made a significant progress in this idea of moving away from this anthropocentric more towards considering the environment. I'll leave it at that. As we think about it in terms of tourism, the very fact that many tourists are attracted to pristine and scenic environments creates levels of visitation stress that eventually undermines its attractiveness. This gets into the ideas of carrying capacity. How many people can visit a place before we start seeing the environmental destruction, right? Negative environmental actions. And so that really gets into this. And we have to think about it, right? This isn't new. This isn't a new thing. If you take back with the advent of the car, which allowed for exploration, we started seeing national parks and public areas being overrun at them. Visitors were coming in droves. They had more time, they had more money, and we started moving into this urbanization. And there's this naturalistic, this innate sense of I still need to connect to the natural world, which is great, right? I want to go see the parks. I want to go connect to these beautiful places, these people, these places that make us contemplate who we are and what we're doing. That's what the natural world does. It leaves us in awe, right? And there's research there's study after study that's showing we need to be connected and experience and spend time in the natural world. So this isn't necessarily bad. It's it's kind of who we are as part of our human fabric. But if we do it in too large of numbers and in a unsustainable way, it makes the very places that we would want to go unattractive. Last year, the numbers to national parks were as high as they've ever been. And so this problem is not going away. And so we're moving from that environmental awareness to environmental stewardship. So how can we care for the land? And it used to be kind of a more overarching idea, and now we're seeing it as action-oriented as individual. The way that we purchase, the way that we live, and the things that we do is how we're seeing it played out. And so, again, that kind of alludes to what I was just mentioning here is, again, governments kind of laid the foundation for this, but now we see it on a very individual level. And I would probably argue that individually, we, through our actions, we're having a greater impact than some of these policies may or may not have. One of the last things I want to talk about is this idea of a veneer environmentalist and what that kind of looks like in terms of our environmental behaviors and beliefs. When we take a look is that most of us probably fall in, not most of us, you've got the non-environmentalists. These are the people that don't think about the environment and what they do on a daily basis. They probably still have that anthropocentric, manifest destiny mentality. It's here for us. It's here to serve me. The environment will be fine. You've got the true environmentalists who are very conscious in their behaviors, the way that they purchase, the way that they live, and how they affect the environment. And then we get a lot of people living in this kind of a veneer. Veneer might have a bad connotation. It doesn't always mean that it is. It doesn't mean just because part of you live in true doesn't mean you drop back. I mean, it's a scale, right? We don't stay in one space. Most people don't. But the idea of veneer, it's kind of that superficial environment. I do it when it's convenient, when it's easy. If I am looking to book a flight and I look at carbon offsets, I might say, well, if it's $5, I might do it. But if it's $25, that might be too much. I might say, oh, well, I'm going to go stay at this hotel and I value the cheapness of it and the location of it versus maybe its environmental practices. And so that's one way to kind of take a look at it. And, again, the thing looks at it is opportunistic green consumption, again, when it's convenient versus substantial, that's what I strive for. That's where I spend my money. That's what I value. So the ecotourism market. One of the things we're going to explore this summer, through this course, is this idea of motivation. What's motivating people to go to certain places, to engage in tourism and ecotourism? And we're going to do that throughout different, using examples throughout the world. We're going to talk about geography and how that plays into it and how that's kind of changing, where people are willing to travel to, how they're willing to travel to get there, and how does that make it in terms of how long that they would potentially stay. We're going to take a look at it in terms of gender, age, education, income, and occupation, with the gender, age, education, and income being a little bit more relevant for our conversations throughout the course. And hopefully that gives us a sense of, where the size, right? Again, most research would show that ecotourism is still a growing field, and we'll talk about why, okay? And one of the reasons that we can look at it is through this idea of hard and soft ecotourist. We define it in a very categorical manner. You are hard, you are soft, but recognize it's a scale, right? It's not either you are hard or you are soft. What this really looks like is soft is the ideas of there's a superficial environmental commitment. It might be short trips. You're not really willing to kind of rough it, if you will, to have this unique experience. You still look for areas of convenience. It might not be physically challenging. You want the interaction with nature to be very convenient. You might even use the term shallow for it. You want it in a more controlled environment. Even the type of educational piece could be a shallow experience with that. Where on the other end, you get the hard, right? Where you've got this strong commitment towards a unique experience where you were willing to go with smaller groups, take longer trips. You're willing to take on maybe physical challenges. You want a deep interaction with nature, and you really are striving for something unique, right? Something that's different. Someplace that maybe others haven't been, right? You'll oftentimes make your own travel arrangements, and you'll kind of figure it out as you go. Some people would say, think about the post-college, I'm backpacking Europe type of experience, right? It might be more towards that hard tourist versus that soft is, well, I kind of want to go to this cool place that maybe others haven't gone, but I don't really want to do the logistics because I don't have the time, but I do have some financial resources. So oftentimes there are some very strong correlations between hard and soft ecotourism and age and the economics of it, right? Income, if you will. And again, recognize that people will sometimes do soft experiences and hard experiences as part of a singular, longer travel experience as well. And so we'll be constantly going back to these ideas of hard and soft ecotourist and what type of experience is this catered toward? Is it really for the hard or the soft ecotourism? Tourist. The last thing I'll leave you with, in my experience, oftentimes hard ecotourists open up areas and regions of the world to soft ecotourism. If you think about almost all of the popular places that you would go today for ecotourism, right? You can think about how Costa Rica has developed. Think about how Thailand has developed. Think about how currently the hot spot is Iceland. Little dad joke, right? Hot spot, Iceland. No? But using Iceland is that was being explored because the infrastructure wasn't necessarily not there in country, but when you would land, you would have to figure a lot more out. And so it takes more time, takes more of a willingness to be uncomfortable. It takes you a little bit more reliance on the locals to kind of embrace you. Maybe sometimes you're one of the first of 50, 100 tourists to ever come to an area. Once those places, pictures come back, social media is changing this, and there's a few really relevant examples of that. But as that plays out and people start seeing it, that starts opening up. I would argue since social media, it's allowed for the explosion of places much quicker. Right? Before, people would have to write stories, I would tell a friend, and it would kind of spread more organically. Now, people get paid to go to these unique places and write about it and send pictures. But still, hard tourists, ecotourists often open up areas to soft ecotourism. And we've seen that, and then ultimately, once soft ecotourism kind of takes place, you will start seeing the evolution of mass ecotourism. In some cases, it has flipped. You'll get a mass ecotourism kind of comes in, big kind of resorts, and then after that, ecotourism starts playing into it as well from a very excursionary standpoint. So we'll use a couple of real examples to highlight both of those throughout our time together.